So, what did people think of Luther's 95 Theses? Well, they said that he nailed it. No, sixth period, if you're listening, that does not count towards my dad joke quota, BT dubs. So, last time, Luther issues a very public attack on the Catholic Church. We called them the 95 Theses. This is the first domino in the long chain of events that leads to the Protestant Reformation. We talked about Luther being summoned to the Diet of Worms, and he is politely, or let's say less politely, asked by the Catholic Church to recant his beliefs. If Luther says yes, well, then his whole Protestant revolution goes down in a ball of fire. If he says no, then Luther is basically signing his own death warrant. What does Luther do? Well, he signs his own death warrant, in effect, where he says he cannot and will not recant. So Luther is basically kidnapped by Frederick Augustus, the Duke of Saxony. You don't need to know that. But essentially, Luther is smuggled to Frederick Augustus's estate, where he's almost literally kept up in the guy's attic. You might be asking, what is he doing during that time period? Well, he invites Mrs. Luther to reside with him. He gets married. One of the important parts of basically eliminating celibacy for priests and prohibitions on marriage for priests. He also begins translating the Bible into German. Remember, the Bible had basically been exclusively in either Latin or Greek, and the argument was that this was so that people would not be able to go directly to the Bible to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church. They would be dependent upon their local Latin-speaking priest or vicar, etc. Now, Luther is not only creating his own church, he's also creating his own Bible. Now, what's interesting about this, and this is even just sort of stepping away from religion, Shakespeare is generally considered one of the authors of the modern English language, or at least a pretty significant influence on how modern English evolves. There's an argument that I have heard that basically Martin Luther is the German equivalent of Shakespeare. That Luther's German Bible is one of the most significant sources of the written German language in history up to that date. So most of the points here are pretty much review, including sola fide, the idea of salvation by faith. But one thing I also want to go over is the fact that Luther was less hostile to commerce relative to the Catholic Church. Remember, the Catholic Church had all kinds of rules against things like, for example, usury, which was a sometimes followed rule that prohibited the charging of interest on loans. Somewhat ironically, for someone who began his church based upon opposition to certain business practices, the sale of indulgences, Martin Luther is generally considered much more pro-business than the Catholic Church. He doesn't view merchants and business people as being inherently sinful. He believes that being a merchant is a calling from God like any other calling to a specific occupation. What he objects to, however, are the shady business practices like those used to sell indulgences, prominently practiced by Johann Tetzel. I'm not going to prattle on too much about the results of the Protestant Reformation. I'll let you pause and read these. If you have any questions, ask them in class, but I think for the most part they speak for themselves. The only thing I'll point out here is, look, separated at birth, they're like twinsies. Like the material on Martin Luther, I'm going to go into significantly more depth on Henry VIII and John Calvin. So basically, Luther spearheads a wave of Protestant churches. Basically, by the end of this period, there's going to be three Protestant churches. There's going to be the Lutheran Church, there's going to be the Church of England, and finally, and I would argue almost most significantly, you're going to get various churches with a common philosophy and doctrine called Calvinist churches. Okay, so English Reformation. Martin Luther wanted to stand by his faith. Henry VIII wanted to stand by his dynasty. And if you know that and keep that in mind, pretty much everything else makes sense here. Um, except the whole, murdering his wives thing. So, the man who might be the most iconic and certainly one of the most fashionable kings of England, ironically, was never destined to be one himself. Henry was not the eldest child. The eldest child was his older brother, Arthur Tudor. But Arthur Tudor dies prematurely. At that point, Arthur is either married or engaged to a Spanish princess, one Catherine of Aragon. Following West Virginian dynastic rules, Henry VIII, who is now becomes Prince of Wales, decides to marry Catherine, and she becomes his queen. So, a little bit of backstory on the Tudors. So, the Tudors are a new dynasty that have come to the English throne, and they have only come to the English throne because of a long, drawn-out civil war. And by the way, the Tudors are not the incumbent monarchs. They basically replaced the old Plantagenet kings that have been ruling England since the Norman Conquest, 1066. And there's a long, devastating war called the War of the Roses. So I think the best way to introduce the War of the Roses without getting into a ton of detail, because even for me, the back and forth is very confusing. So when George R.R. Martin was brainstorming ideas for his Game of Thrones series, he was apparently inspired, Westeros was apparently inspired by the War of the Roses. So if you know anything about Game of Thrones and how brutal and cutthroat and Machiavellian it is, apparently that is inspired by that conflict. So that just kind of gives you a taste of how confusing, brutal, and devastating the War of the Roses was. Now, Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, or Henry Tudor, comes to the throne, but they are a very new monarchy. There's still a lot of people who were sort of Plantagenet loyalists, and they also feel that the Tudors are a family of usurpers. In other words, they don't have a legitimate claim to the throne. Also, another strike against the Tudors to a certain extent is they are not really authentically English by extraction. They are Welsh. So you can also sort of view them as a family of almost outsiders. Henry's first goal, Henry VIII's first goal, is to preserve his dynasty. The only way you can preserve your dynasty is, well, according to the Bible, you have to be fruitful and multiply. You have to have an heir. So the problem with Catherine of Aragon is she does not produce a male heir. And hey, it takes two to tango. But the fact is that Catherine, even when Henry marries her, is not at advanced age, but she is basically entering a period of her life where her fertility window is rapidly declining. So Henry decides that it would be really nice if he could marry his comparatively more fertile younger mistress, one Anne Boleyn. TLDR, she is the mother of the future Queen Elizabeth. Okay, so the problem is that the Catholic Church kind of takes a dim view on divorce. I hope that's not that much of a shock to any of you. So Henry can't say, "Dear Pope, I would really like you to allow me to divorce my wife in order to marry my mistress." That ain't gonna fly very well. So Henry instead asks for an annulment. And an annulment basically is not a divorce because an annulment presupposes that the marriage was flawed to begin with and wasn't a real marriage. So how is a marriage flawed? Or how does a marriage, how can we pretend that a marriage doesn't really exist in the first place? Well, if a marriage is not consummated. In other words, if the couple have not had sex. So, Henry is going to make that argument with a straight face. If Henry were a Dungeons and Dragons character, his highest ability would probably be intelligence, and his lowest would be wisdom. So he's not a dumb guy, he's just a very smart guy who ends up making dumb decisions. We'll see some of that a little bit later. But he is very intelligent, very eloquent, and he decides to use that to set the stage for his request for an annulment. So he knows that the Catholic Church primary irritant right now is that meddlesome German monk by the name of Martin Luther. And so Henry VIII basically writes an essay roasting the guy and calling him out for even daring to question the supremacy of the Catholic Church. And then Henry also adds, by the way, it would be really cool if I could annul the marriage with my wife, Catherine of Aragon. Now, the Pope at the time, Clement VII, was actually only too happy to grant that request for Henry. There's a problem, though, and that problem is that the Pope was currently having a bit of an argument with the most powerful man in Europe, Emperor Charles V. Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, by the way. Now, how do we know they were having an argument? Well, when Charles V's army started besieging the city of Rome, which was, of course, the capital of the papacy, that's generally considered a pretty good indication that things were not going swimmingly between the two. So the problem was that Charles V was at the gates of Rome, and he was already pretty peeved. A good way to peeve the guy off further would be to end the marriage between Henry VIII and Charles V's favorite auntie, Catherine of Aragon. So the Pope decides to not grant the annulment, but he does give Henry a fancy title, Defender of the Faith, which, I kid ye not, is still a title used by the monarchs of England and still adorns the coinage of British coins today. The problem is that Henry VIII is no kindergartner wanting a sticker on his artwork. Instead, he's the King of England who rapidly needs to establish some security for his dynasty. So Henry VIII realizes that if he just makes his own church, he can ask me to grant me a divorce for me. And so that's what he does. He creates the Anglican Church, and basically think of it like this. It takes a while for churches to sort of establish doctrine and ideas and rules, that sort of thing. And Henry doesn't have time for that. So he does the 21st century equivalent of going to all the rules and doctrine of the Catholic Church, highlighting everything, pressing Control or Command C, and then on the document entitled Anglican Church, he presses Control or Command V. But he also realizes there needs to be some differences, so he goes to find Control or Command F, and he types in the word Pope. Then, under the place all text box, he types in King of England, presses replace all, and boom, you've got an Anglican church. But note what's happening here. You're not really changing any of the theology. You are simply replacing the Pope with the King as head of the church. This means that the monarchs of England were extremely powerful during this period, because when you combine the power of the church with that of the state, let's just say that's an amazing amount of power. Disliking a hymn, for example, that they play during Mass all the time is not just, making a stand based on religious criticism. It could potentially be outright treason, because the Church of England is led by the King of England. Also, what this entitles Henry to do is Henry and his forces basically raid a bunch of Catholic monasteries and take away anything and everything of value. He is able to marry Anne Boleyn, but as many of you know, that will not be the last marriage. Henry will have a total of 6 wives, will have a male heir eventually, but that male heir dies pretty shortly after he's crowned, and in fact, it is Anne Boleyn's daughters, Mary and later Elizabeth, who both ascend to the throne in succession. Sorry, just kidding. Catherine of Aragon was Mary's mother, and Boleyn was Elizabeth's mother. On the one hand, I feel like I should be fired for that oversight. On the other hand, Henry, like, my dude, why did you have to make this so complicated for history teachers to teach? Like, you could have just picked one. Pick one. So Luther creates his church based on conviction by faith, and Henry VIII builds his church because he wants to trade down for a younger model. Um, Many younger models, actually. So, as you might imagine, there aren't very many theological differences between the Church of England and the Catholic Church. There will be Protestants in the future, including the ancestors of the Pilgrims and the Puritans, that will want England to more thoroughly adopt Protestant theology. Protestant theology spearheaded by this guy, Jean Calvin, a French-Swiss theologian who is based in the city of Geneva, that he basically runs as a theocracy. In other words, as a society based upon religious rules and norms. So, John Calvin probably has the most radical version of Protestantism compared to the other people we've talked about. Because remember, Luther, I think in his heart of hearts, still loved the church. He hated what it had become, but he didn't set out to try to destroy Christendom. And there weren't, I mean, there were differences on issues like salvation and the role of the Pope, but obviously, if you look at the difference between Lutherans and Catholics, they agreed on more than they disagreed. The same is definitely true for the Catholic Church and the Church of England. But once you get to John Calvin, Protestant definitely looks like it's protesting something. So John Calvin's theology was based on one key insight that he had. And I want you to kind of bear with me because this is going to tie your brain in some knots. So God is supposed to be all-loving and all-knowing, omniscient, right? And salvation, especially salvation by faith, is supposed to be a choice. So the issue that this creates is if you're an omniscient God and somebody is going to choose whether or not to have faith in you, doesn't that make it less of a choice? Because God knows what you're going to do anyway. So at that point, is salvation really a choice in the first place? So achieving salvation, according to John Calvin, isn't just like fire insurance. He believes that salvation radiates through everything a human being does, because you are a member of God's elect, the people he has chosen from the beginning of time. So because of that, your salvation should be clear to everyone. So the way I kind of put it is that if you are part of God's elect, you don't stub your toe, you don't get hit by buses, you don't declare bankruptcy, good things should happen to you. This idea of predetermined destination is kind of what gives rise to the idea of the Protestant work ethic, because it means that, for example, you should labor for the kingdom of heaven. You should be incredibly productive in your life. However, you shouldn't be seen as enjoying the fruits of your labor. By the way, Calvinists are the direct ancestor, or if not, distant uncle or aunt, of many of the Protestant denominations in the United States today, and they are the direct ancestors of the Puritans and Pilgrims, by the way. So the Catholic Church can't really take all this sitting down. Obviously, Martin Luther may have been just an aberration, but the fact that now you have Martin Luther, King Henry VIII, and of course John Calvin, that means that, well, there are some deeper, more systemic problems. So the Catholic Church convenes a Council of Trent in which they begin a counter-reformation. And the way it works is, on the one hand, they have to make some changes, but they can't change too much. Because if you change too much, well, then you've just become Protestant yourself, right? So here's what they do. they agree to abandon the sale of indulgences, which takes away most of the reason that Martin Luther began his Protestant Reformation in the first place. And the idea is to genuinely bring the Catholic population back to the church in order to establish a relationship with God and Christ through the church. The other thing that happens is that extra attention is focused on the New World in order to make up for lost converts. So you have new missionary efforts that are organized at the Council of Trent, including the Jesuit order founded by Ignatius Loyola. Indulgences are now history, and there's some effort to focus on the financial and corruption and just internal corruption in general in the Catholic Church, including the promotion of friends and family members into high-ranking positions in the church, and the purchasing of positions within the Catholic Church called simony. So those are officially abolished. On the flip side, if you look at, for example, the marriage of and celibacy of priests, that policy is not really altered. Also, Latin is still the primary language of the Catholic Church, is until the 1960s in what we call the Second Vatican Council. So, Mass for another 400-ish years is still going to be conducted in, by the 20th century, a language that few people outside the church and universities actually speak. So on that semi-depressing observation, we will end. Martin Luther has, intended to start a conversation. Instead, he starts a revolution. Next time, that revolution transforms into a world war.